The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in February 1934. It was short. It was cold. It said only that Reverend Oswald Chambers had collapsed during the night and was not expected to recover. His daughter read it twice, standing in the hallway of the mission house in Cairo, still in her housecoat, the paper trembling slightly in her fingers. She had spoken to him just 3 days before. He had been laughing. He had been making tea. She did not cry. Not yet. She folded the telegram and pressed it against her chest, and for a long moment she simply stood there in the gray morning light, listening to the sound of the street outside. The vendors, the carts, the ordinary noise of a world that did not know it had just lost something irreplaceable. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before Oswald Chambers became the man whose words would outlive him by a century, before he became the voice that millions of people would open each morning, before they opened their eyes to face the day, he was just a boy in Aberdeen who could not stop asking questions that made the adults in the room uncomfortable. Oswald Chambers was born in 1874 in Perth, Scotland, the fourth son of a Baptist minister named Clarence Chambers and his wife Hannah. The family moved often, as ministry families do, and by the time Oswald was a teenager they had settled in London. He was not a difficult child exactly, but he was relentless. His father later recalled that Oswald would corner him after Sunday sermons and demand to know not what the passage meant, but why it mattered, not what God said, but what God wanted. The distinction, his father admitted, was one he had never quite been pressed on before. At 15, Oswald gave his life to Christ at a service led by Charles Spurgeon. He would later describe that night as the moment the floor dropped out from under him. Not in terror, but in the way a man standing in a shallow pool suddenly realizes the water goes down forever. He had expected to feel settled. He felt, instead, like something had been cracked open. He enrolled at the National Art Training School in London. He was talented, genuinely talented. His sketchbooks from those years show a young man with an eye for shadow and light that his instructors considered rare. There was talk of a career. There was talk of Paris. There was, for a brief stretch of time, a version of Oswald Chambers' life that looked very ordinary and very promising and had absolutely nothing to do with the thing he was about to become. He left it behind without fanfare. He told a friend simply that he felt called to preach and that the art, much as he loved it, was not the thing. The friend thought he was wasting his life. Oswald thanked him for his honesty and went north to study at Dunoon College in Scotland. The years at Dunoon were, by his own account, the hardest of his life, not because of the work. The work he loved, the Greek, the theology, the late nights arguing over Calvin and Wesley with the other students. He loved all of it with a ferocity that unnerved some of his professors, who preferred students who nodded and took notes. What broke him at Dunoon was something else entirely. It was the silence. Not the external silence of the Scottish countryside, which he had come to appreciate, but an internal silence, a sense that God, having called him and uprooted him and stripped him of his art and his prospects, had now gone quiet. He prayed and felt nothing. He read and felt nothing. He preached student sermons that he knew were technically correct and felt, in the delivering of them, like a man reciting a recipe. He confided this to a missionary who visited the college, a woman named Margaret Ballantyne, who had spent 20 years in West Africa and who had by that point heard every possible variation of spiritual crisis a young man could have. She listened to him without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him steadily and said, "You are waiting for a feeling. Stop waiting." He did not fully understand what she meant. Not then. But he wrote it down. He kept a journal his entire life, dozens of them eventually, and that sentence appears in one of the earliest ones, underlined twice, with a question mark after it that was later crossed out and replaced with a small, decisive period. The breakthrough came, as it often does, when he had stopped looking for it. He was 26. He was attending a series of meetings in which a speaker kept returning to the phrase entire sanctification, the idea, drawn from John Wesley, that the Holy Spirit could so thoroughly inhabit a person that their very desires could be remade. Oswald was skeptical. He had heard the language before and found it frequently used by people who seemed, on close inspection, just as self-interested as everyone else. But one evening, something in him simply stopped resisting. He would describe it later not as an emotional experience, not as a vision, not as anything dramatic at all. He said it was more like a key turning in a lock that he had not known was locked. One moment the door was closed. The next, it was open, and the wind that came through was nothing he had manufactured. For 4 years after that evening, Oswald Chambers traveled. He went to America, then to Japan. He spoke in churches, in lecture halls, in parlors, in rooms above shops where a dozen people squeezed onto borrowed chairs. He was not famous. He was not even particularly well known. What people consistently reported, though, was that after hearing him speak, they did not feel inspired in the way a good speech inspires. They felt seen, exposed, sometimes uncomfortably, but seen. A woman in Cincinnati wrote in her diary after attending one of his talks. He did not tell us anything we did not already know, but he said it in such a way that we understood, for the first time, that we had known it in our heads and not in our bones. He showed us the difference. He returned to England and, in 1906, founded what he called the Bible Training College in Clapham. It was less a college in the formal sense, and more a house where people came to be undone and remade. Students there remember mornings beginning before dawn with prayer that sometimes lasted 2 hours, not performative prayer, not the kind with long pauses for rhetorical effect, but urgent prayer, the way you talk when the stakes are real. They remember Oswald teaching with chalk and a small blackboard, pacing, stopping mid-sentence to stare out the window as if reconsidering something, then turning back with a revised thought that was always better than the original. He married in 1910. His wife, Gertrude Hobbs, Biddy, as she was called by everyone who loved her, was a stenographer who could take dictation at extraordinary speed. Those who knew them described the marriage as one of those rare partnerships in which two people are so genuinely suited to each other's gifts that it is almost impossible to say. Afterward, where one's contribution ends and the other's begins. Biddy took notes on everything, every sermon, every lecture in which Oswald said something worth keeping. She had been doing this, informally, for years before they married. She would go on doing it long after his death because it was through her notes, her meticulous, faithful, stenographic notes, that his words would eventually reach the world in a form the world could hold. She was the one who would, years later, assemble those notes into a book, a daily devotional, a slim volume with a plain cover and a title that came from a line he had spoken in a sermon. The title was My Utmost for His Highest. It would become, within 2 decades of its publication, one of the best-selling Christian books ever printed. It has never gone out of print. Not once, in nearly 100 years, but none of that had happened yet. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Oswald was 40 years old. He was not drafted. He could have stayed in Clapham. He could have gone on teaching and writing, and leading the small, serious community that had gathered around his work. He volunteered instead to go to Egypt. The YMCA was running huts near the military encampments at Zaytown, outside Cairo, places where soldiers could come for tea and letters and something approximating a normal evening. Oswald went to run one of these huts. He brought Biddy and their young daughter Kathleen, and a willingness to be useful in whatever way was needed. The soldiers were not always easy. Some were devout and came to his informal talks with open notebooks. Others came because it was warm and there was nowhere else to go, and they wanted to see if this chaplain was the sort who would bore them, or the sort who would say something true. A significant number had decided, in the particular way that comes from watching men die in quantities that make individual death feel theoretical, that God was either absent or capricious, or simply not the kind of being who could be addressed directly. Oswald did not argue with them. That was the thing that surprised people. He did not meet their doubts with defenses. He met them with more questions. He would sit across from a soldier who had told him God was dead and ask, very quietly, what kind of God the soldier had in mind when he said that, because he had found, in his experience, that the God most people stopped believing in was a God he was not sure he believed in either. The conversations that followed were sometimes hours long. Kathleen, who was 10 when they arrived in Egypt and 12 when her father died there, would say many years later that she believed those hut conversations, those late nights with exhausted soldiers in a canvas room with a single lantern, were the work her father had been made for. Not the college, not the books, this. He died on November 15, 1917. He was 43 years old. The cause was a ruptured appendix, a thing that should have been survivable, and would have been, had the military hospital not been so overwhelmed with wounded that the diagnosis came too late. He had been complaining of pain for days. He had refused, more than once, to let the doctors prioritize him over the soldiers coming in from the front. Biddy was with him at the end. Kathleen was not. She was asleep in the mission house when it happened, and she woke to someone standing in the doorway of her room, and she knew from the way the woman stood, the particular stillness of a person who has run out of gentle ways to say something, before a single word was spoken. She had just turned 13. Here is something worth understanding. When Oswald Chambers died, he had published almost nothing. A handful of articles, a few small pamphlets. He had been, in any measurable sense, a man of limited reach, known to several hundred people who had studied under him or heard him speak, but unknown to the wider world, and certainly not the kind of figure who seemed destined for the shelf of a stranger's nightstand 100 years later. What Biddy did in the years that followed was extraordinary, not because it required genius, though it required considerable skill, but because it required the kind of patient, unhurried faithfulness that is harder, in many ways, than any dramatic act. She went home to England after the war. She took with her dozens of notebooks, all in her own hand, containing every word Oswald had spoken that she had managed to capture. She began to organize them, not to edit, not to polish, not to improve. She was meticulous about that distinction. Her job, as she understood it, was to let him speak as accurately as she could in the form that would serve the most people. She worked on those notes for years. Her daughter helped, eventually. Friends helped. The process was slow and careful and entirely unglamorous. The first edition of My Utmost for His Highest was published in 1927, a decade after his death. It was not an immediate sensation. It spread the way that genuinely useful things spread, quietly, from hand to hand. One person giving a copy to another person who was in some kind of pain and finding, to their surprise, that this man they had never heard of seemed to have been writing directly to them. By the time of Biddy's own death in 1966, the book had sold millions of copies. It had been translated into dozens of languages. Franklin Roosevelt had kept a copy by his bedside. At least 3 American presidents after him read it daily. It was found in the kit bags of soldiers and the desk drawers of missionaries and the handbags of ordinary women who had never considered themselves particularly religious, but who had been given a copy by someone who loved them during a difficult year. None of them had ever heard Oswald Chambers speak. None of them knew what he looked like when he paced with the chalk, stopping mid-sentence to look out the window. None of them knew about the 4 years of silence at Danoon, or the evening the lock turned, or the hours in the canvas hut in Egypt. They knew only what Biddy had saved, and what she had saved was enough. There is a question worth sitting with here, and it is the same question Oswald himself returned to constantly in his teaching. Why does faithfulness so often look, from the outside, like smallness? He spent the last 2 years of his life in a YMCA hut in Egypt, pouring tea for exhausted soldiers who were going back in the morning to something they could not describe to their families, and could not describe to each other, and could only sometimes whisper about in the dark to a man who asked the right questions and did not flinch at the answers. He had left behind a promising career. He had given up the art. He had chosen, over and over again, the smaller and less visible path, not out of self-punishment, not out of some theological duty, but because he genuinely believed that faithfulness in the small, unwitnessed moment was the only kind of faithfulness that meant anything at all. He was right. We know this because of what it produced. But he did not know it would produce anything. He did not know about the millions of books. He did not know about the soldiers who would carry his words into their own wars in 1943 and 1950 and 1967. He did not know about the woman in Manitoba who would open his daily devotional on the worst morning of her life and feel, for the first time in months, that she was not alone. He was faithful without a map, without a guarantee, without any particular evidence, in the years that looked most like failure, that the thing he was doing would outlast him by so much as a single day. His daughter Kathleen lived until 1997. She was 93 years old. In one of her last interviews, she was asked what she wanted people to know about her father. Not about the books, not about the legacy, but about the man. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was always the same. Whether he was speaking to 1,000 people or making tea for one tired soldier, he was always the same. There was no performance and no audience. He was just there, completely there." She paused again. "I think that was the thing. He was completely there wherever he was. And somehow that was enough to last forever." The question Oswald Chambers asked in those Egyptian nights is the same one that echoes in his writing across 100 years of readers. Not, "Are you good enough?" Not, "Have you done enough?" But simply this: where are you right now in this moment, and are you fully present to what is being asked of you? It is an uncomfortable question. It was meant to be. He believed, and his life is the argument for it, that God does not need your credentials or your resume or your certainty. He needs your presence, your willingness to be in the room, in the hut, in the gray morning light with the telegram in your hands, and to remain. That is all. That is, somehow, everything.